Back in 1992, Canada ranked second in HDI. Today, it ranks 16th. Canada has a productivity problem, economic growth problem, affordability problem, healthcare problem, migration problem. Or maybe it has an oligopoly problem. No other oligopoly is as public and dominant as the big five banks of Canada. The bank towers rule the Toronto skyline, just as the banks own the Canadian economy. I don't think there is any other major city where few companies own such a big concentration of the skyline. This might sound like an exaggeration, but I actually had trouble finding a recent enough footage of Toronto that reflects the rising bank towers in the city. In the last 5 years, 4 new bank towers were built in Toronto, almost one every year. Toronto is one of the most cyberpunk-looking cities with fluorescent bank logos ominously shining through the fog at night. There is no mistaking who owns Canada's largest city. CIBC, RBC, TD, Scotiabank, BMO, and National Bank employ almost 300,000 Canadians. 13,000 people work in CIBC Square alone. This is within a single building, in a single city. Canadian banks are just massive. The Big Five banks and the National Bank are the only officially designated oligopolies in our list, as they were designated as systemically important banks by OSFI in 2013. On the surface, this title comes with additional regulatory oversight and responsibility for these banks, but in reality, it means that they are too big to fail. They are basically insured by the government. Two of these banks, TD and RBC, are even listed as globally important banks. I think one key question to ask is, how did the banking oligopoly form to begin with? The first thing to understand about banking is that it is inherently government dependent. Despite being the poster child of free market capitalism, all banking systems in the world were created by political circumstances. Property rights, regulatory oversight, liquidity requirements, and government interference and involvement can result in entirely different banking systems. That is to say, there is no natural free market state of banking, and all banking systems in the world were directly created by the government. Canadian banking oligopoly emerged almost immediately as a result of national banking laws. As opposed to the United States, Canadian banking regulation was chartered federally from the very beginning, which resulted in the capital accumulating in a few megabanks with thousands of branches. The only reason we still have 6 banks and not 2 or 3 is that regulators have prevented further mergers and chose to maintain the magical number 6. The final domino fell in place in the 1990s with the end of the 4 pillars policy. Until then, banks, trust companies, insurance companies, and investment dealers had to be separate companies. With the end of the 4 pillars policy, the 5 banks we know today gobbled up the others, and thus the final version of Canadian banking was created, with 5 or 6 megabanks controlling every aspect of financial activity, from commercial banking to investment banking to asset management. You will see these 6 names as the largest shareholders in almost every major Canadian company, every single one of them, including each other. The largest shareholder of RBC is BMO, and the largest shareholder of BMO is RBC. RBC, TD, BMO, CIBC, and Scotiabank own a piece of everything. Now, to clarify, this is in the same capacity of ownership as Vanguard or BlackRock has in the American markets. The big 5 banks own these shares mostly through management of their clients' funds, so they don't really own everything, they just manage their clients' funds, who own everything. The Big Five are the Vanguards and BlackRocks of Canada, on top of being the Goldman Sachs and the Bank of Americas. Very few countries in the world have such a distinct monopoly. So, what's different about Canada? Part of it comes naturally with free banking, as I touched on before. When there are no laws preventing mega banks, the capital will inevitably accumulate in a few institutions. Banking is one of those fields where scale is king. The more money and reserves a bank has, the more profitable it gets, and more stable it gets. It's no surprise that after the American government removed banking barriers in the 80s, American banking started to resemble its Canadian counterpart, with a few big players dominating the field. There are two differences between the American and Canadian banking systems though. First is the separation of financial fields in America. In the US, different institutions dominate different sectors of the financial industry, like commercial banking, investment banking, fund management, etc. Meanwhile, in Canada, the Big Five dominate almost all financial fields. So, Bay Street has a lot more verticality compared to Wall Street. Another key difference in Canada is the lack of competition from international players. Most countries will have a few international players in their banking sectors. Likewise, many Canadian banks are big players in other countries. Scotiabank dominates the Peruvian banking, BMO and RBC are massive in Chicago, TD has more than 1,000 branches in the US, and RBC is one of the biggest banks in the Caribbean. Meanwhile, there are only a few foreign bank branches in Canada. Bank of America and Citigroup have some presence, especially in capital markets, but really, they are dwarfed. And this is where the government support really does its work for the Big Five banks. Canada has a series of banking regulations that doesn't ban foreign banks from doing business, but makes it very hard in an indirect way. Canadian banking is already a very hard sector to get into. The Big Five are massive on a global scale, and the Canadian market is relatively small. Any foreign competitor will have to face extreme competition, and the potential rewards aren't that great. The Canadian government just needs to nudge the markets just so slightly to keep the current market status quo. And it does just that by preventing any big mergers between the Big Five banks and making things just slightly too hard for foreigners to compete with the Big Five. The entrenched market forces do the rest. Now, the final question here: what does the banking oligopoly cost us? And my answer is not much. Canada has one of the most stable banking systems in the world. I think American banking has a lot more to learn from Canadian banking than the other way around. Banking sector has two main functions. One, to provide broad access to credit and money, and two, to protect your money. And Big Five banks do that wonderfully. Canadians have just as much access to credit as any American, and our government doesn't spend trillions every decade or so bailing our bankers out. Yes, Canada has a series of economic problems, lack of investment, and productivity issues compared to the US, but those have a lot more to do with other economic problems than our banks. In fact, many academic research indicate that America has an over-financialization problem. Too much financial innovation isn't always good for the economy. Canadian banks generate great profits internationally and employ hundreds of thousands of Canadians, meanwhile serving its main purpose of providing access to credit and financial stability. So, if it isn't broken, why fix it?